Well, good evening and welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources to hopefully improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. I'm here with my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
And
we got an
today,
interesting guest. She knows all about what's going on in Washington.
Well, let me give her a brief introduction. We have a very special guest, Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, who is a senior fellow in governance studies, the director of Center for Technology Innovation, and serves as the co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank at the Brookings Institute. Dr. Turner Lee researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the U.S. and to harness its power to create change in communities across the world. Dr. Lee's most recent publications address bias in machine learning and the digital divide, and her forthcoming book is Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, coming out sometime this year, or I guess in 2021. So, Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, welcome to Community and Technology.
Oh, thanks for having me, and great to be here, Stu and Dave. I've always, find this a pleasure to come out and just kick the can around tech and community. So thank you for having me today.
Absolutely, absolutely. We try and keep the show focused on real life issues, particularly as it relates to people of color. And Dave is a journalist who's been in the telecom space for a couple of decades, writing and researching. And I want to kind of throw the ball to him because I know he has some things about antitrust that he wanted to put on the table. Go ahead, Dave.
Nicole, what do you think about the House report on antitrust that came the other day that says we should break up Google and Facebook?
I haven't had a chance to read all 443 pages, so you're putting me at a disadvantage. It just came out at 6 o'clock last night. I mean, what we did know is that the Democrats were essentially going to come up with this. We have a podcast at Brookings called Tech Tank, where Chairman Cicilline was actually part of one of those podcasts where he actually did preview the Glass-Steagall Act in terms of what he wanted to do with big tech in terms of anti-competitive behavior. I think what's going to be interesting about this process is here we are a few weeks out of the election. We have an issue that is pretty much on the minds of Democrats. And what was so interesting yesterday after the Democrat report came in, the Republican report came in soon after, as well as a minority report from Congressman Senator Ken Buck. I think going forward, we're definitely going to see big tech on the alert with regards to a much more careful scrutiny of their business practices, in addition to the potential for regulation in a more formal, structured way, right? Because we've seen big tech sort of lambasted for bad behavior, but not necessarily, outside of the fines or the law enforcement that has occurred at various agencies. We really haven't seen them have to really comply with a lot of rules. So it will be interesting going forward, the extent to which those recommendations in the House report are either adopted, which may actually not happen under the fact that we're, going into an election and we're not sure what Congress is going to look like. But it's also the possibility of it to be a conversation starter in terms of what we need to be thinking about when we think about some of the practices that are coming from the major companies that are driving the majority of internet traffic.
Mm-hmm. And what do you personally think should be done? We're talking about $5 trillion market cap and near total control of much of the many basic internet functions. How do we deal with that? Obviously, the market has failed. We have something close to monopolies.
Yeah, I agree, Dave. I mean, I think that there has to be something that's done around this. I mean, look at it and look at the state of big tech, or quote unquote tech clash prior to the pandemic, and look at the type of market control that we're seeing as everything has migrated online. The question is really going to become, not necessarily what Nicol Turner Lee thinks about it, because I don't think people care a lot. They do care, just to pat myself on the back, but maybe not a lot. But I think the question is, the extent to which there'll be some type of regulation that will be put in place that will lend itself to some agility and some flexibility when it comes to the pace of innovation, while at the same time having the type of law enforcement needed to ensure that those regulations do not go, sort of unspoken or unaccounted for. So in the House Democrat report, there's a conversation about resourcing the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, the Department of Justice, as well as other potential law enforcement agencies. And in some cases, my colleague, Tom Wheeler, former FCC chairman, has suggested that we create a new digital office, an office to manage platform regulation. I think going forward, some type of regulation is going to be inevitable. And whether that regulation is applied to mergers and acquisitions, whether it's applied to deceptive practices that actually come, whether it's applied to, tech companies sort of crowded the marketplace or engaging in anti-democratic behavior, quote unquote, something is going to happen. But I honestly have to tell you, I think before an election, it's very hard to determine the extent to which there'll be the type of regulation we're all talking about. If we potentially have a Trump-Pence rerun, there may be, as we saw in the minority report of Buck, as well as the general Republican report, there may be more of a leaning towards the regulation of tech companies around speech versus what I think Cicilline is talking about, the structural makeup of these companies that in and of itself lend itself to blurred lines between their control of the market and their sale to the market, their mergers and acquisitions of smaller companies or crowding them out, or the potential to do something, on the House Democrat proposal where law enforcement is inevitable for the behaviors of these companies. So, the jury is still out, as is the jury is out somewhat for the upcoming election.
Yeah. And somehow I don't think any of this is going to get through the Senate in the next 6 years, which is presumably why people like Tom and Phil Revere are saying they'll take a small piece that doesn't add up to very much because it's better than nothing.
Yeah, I go on that though. I do think that we'll see something happen. I don't want to be as pessimistic that the Senate will be as dysfunctional under a potential Biden-Harris victory. I think that there will be tech issues that will come with more of a framework of governance and some principles around what we should be looking at that won't be as loosey-goosey and impulsive as this current administration, who, picks friends and enemies like TikTok and other companies to kind of go after without any coherent policy framework. So I do think that I don't want us to be as pessimistic. Bill Baer, who actually works on my team at the Center for Technology Innovation at Brookings, has suggested that there will be some type of tweaks to the type of regulatory frameworks that are applied, or potentially just a rejiggering of antitrust laws, right? Even if it's a small adaptation, it actually may be an adaptation that ensures some level of equity that is in the digital marketplace, which is now going to be, much more widely accepted and used.
Yeah, but break it down for us, Nicole, for the folks that maybe aren't as sophisticated with some of the issues. How do the issues of concentration of ownership and control dovetail with the issues of speech that we're seeing, the hate speech and so many other things that are going on in terms of political rhetoric, negative political rhetoric on these platforms? How does that dovetail with the ownership concentration? How do you see that playing out?
It's interesting, and I love, Stu, that you asked that question, because I think that this is where we draw the line in the sand as to extent of what we're going to see with tech policy under either administration. I mean, first and foremost, I need to give your listeners some context. I mean, we're talking about now a very small and, a very constricted media marketplace that in the previous years consisted of more media diversity in terms of ownership, in terms of Black and brown entrepreneurs and station owners, to now we're in a spot where what we're basically seeing is the fact that different changes to rules have resulted in, less ownership by diversity and more, I think, magnification of messages through platforms that have become the new publishers of the 21st century. And so if you begin to look at those publishers as sort of controlling the narrative, then you come up with the Republican response, which is essentially how is it that conservatives can be denied voice on the internet, which is really not true. I mean, what the conservatives are complaining about is the next stage of this, which is algorithmic bias and discrimination, because they feel that their opinions are not necessarily, being heard. With that being said, Stu, this has huge implications on the level of misinformation and disinformation that will actually continue to follow us, from the 2016 election. The less diversity of voices that you have, the less platforms, the fewer platforms that you have for people to speak out, the more you're going to see concentrated buckets of information. And in some cases will be steered towards hate speech, or will strengthen the voices of white supremacists. Or for some people who are listening, may make Black Lives Matter a more prominent voice on the internet than others, right? At the end of the day, these are private platforms. They are not public town squares, right? There's no government leaning on Facebook outside of its use of its platform for city and state elected officials to sort of do town halls. But they have not necessarily, and people get mad at Mark Zuckerberg when he gets up there and says, I'm not an arbiter of truth. Well, no, because he's an arbiter of his shareholders, not truth, right? So at the end of the day, that's what he's responsible for. And so I think we have to also think about this new regulatory framework, which I think, again, and I'll be brief here, I think a Biden-Harris ticket will pay more attention to the lack of fluid voices within the marketplace that allow communities of color to speak more vociferously around their issues. I think that there will be some concern around tech's ability to be inclusive going forward. And I think, we will see the protection of the First Amendment, because I think at the end it benefits all types of groups, from civil rights activists to supremacists to a certain extent. But I think we will see more regulation around what makes good content and what makes transparent content moderation, so that the processes in which these companies make decisions are not driven by ad-based models, but rather by decisions that are open and transparent and fair among the populace that use those platforms.
Now, Dave, before you jump back in, let me just say that we are talking on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. This is Community Technology with Stu Reid Dave Burstein, and a very special guest today, Dr. Nicol Turner Lee. And we're talking about antitrust and the big tech giants on the internet. Dave, I think you wanted to jump in there.
Right. Yeah, I have a photo in front of me of the 9 top people at Google. How many of them do you think are black or brown?
Oh, probably none of them. I already know they had one that is no longer employed.
Not in the top according to their financial statements, which is what I looked at. And I had another picture of Mark Zuckerberg with his top team of about a dozen people. How many of them do you think were white males?
I would say pretty much all of them. Stu, you got to give me some harder questions, dude.
Our question is how the blank do we change that?
Well, that's the challenge.
More voices on. You're not to get more voices on. Jerry Nad was my old roommate, and he really is not a radical. There was always this. I mean, I knew him when some of our friends decided to actually be radical. He's always been a liberal, and that's okay. I don't feel like throwing bombs either. But he came out for structural separation, and you know Tim Wool, don't you?
Yep.
Okay, if you go through what Tim has done, they basically come to the conclusion that a little bit of regulation is going to have about as much effect as the FCC does on the ridiculously high prices of broadband in America. Right? I mean, I for 20 years, I've been writing about how US prices are 30 and 50 and 75% higher than our peers in Europe. And I don't think a little bit of regulation is going to make much difference. I was really disappointed. I got a long briefing on the Wheeler and Verveer and Gene Kingelman paper.
Yep.
And when you look at it, It basically comes down to you want them to do a little bit better fair dealing with other companies. And I'm thinking about $5 trillion, and I'm thinking near monopolies in the case of Facebook and Google. Margaret Vestager, the European Trust, just turned around and just said, Google and Facebook are monopolies, let's face it. That's not an exact quote, but it was very close to that. So you need to do something strong, which is why even somebody like Jerry, who is not radical, is talking about busting them up. Is that realistic, or is Jerry and Ciccolini looking for something that's not going to happen?
Well, I mean, I think
years from now.
No, I think you're on I think that's the taste of where the Democrats actually want to go with regards to sort of putting a hit towards these tech companies that, you know, for your listeners, have not been under any type of regulation while we operate within a 1934 Communications Act. I mean, you got to remember, much of the problems that we're actually having around technology policy, which date back decades, has a lot to do with the outdated rules and regulations that were designed around the telegraph. And so here we are, you know, almost decades later, and we've gone from, you know, the telegraph to the telephone to mobile to now platforms that in many respects are the communications lifeline for certain communities. I think going forward, it's going to be important to figure out how do you reel in some of those bad behaviors while still encouraging this type of innovation that these American companies are actually putting out there. It's not to say that they're like Ford Motor Company folks. I mean, they're not employing the amount of people that the car industry has employed. But I think what people are suggesting is that they need to be under the same due diligence of accountability when it comes to how their platforms are sort of intersecting with things that we care about, like the democratic process, or like markets like Harlem. I'm from New York, so I'm very familiar with Harlem. You know, and how do smaller actors get into a place when either they're being bought up by big dominant companies or they're being pushed out? I mean, that's an age-old competition problem. And I think, as you know, my colleague Bill has said, and what Tom and Jean and others are insinuating, is that there needs to be something that's going to happen. I cannot really suggest what would be the appropriate course of action, again, given the fluidity of this election cycle. But I think we will see something in January, and I think we'll see something that will at least scare the bejesus out of these companies that they got to get their act together. I mean, Cambridge Analytica basically put Facebook on alert that they needed to change their business practices, and, you know, by all accounts, they're attempting to do so. Well, let me finish. But I want to say one thing, though, and as a person who's been doing this about 25 years and, you know, following the same stuff that you have, I want us to also be cautious that we're not trying to impose legacy regulation on emerging economies of scale. And I want us to be aware that we're just talking about regulation with big tech companies, and we've not really talked about whether or not these companies also pay into the universal service of whether or not people have access. So it's not just one area, right? We have tech companies that make billions of dollars in ad revenue, but yet we still rely upon American consumers to underwrite the Universal Service Fund, which is why 50 million plus kids, about 15 to 16 million of them can't do homework because they don't have broadband at home and they don't have any type of emergency broadband relief. And so I think, again, it's less didactic as we've had in the past, where it's just like, okay, let's impose this on one company. I think we need to do a full analysis and exploration of the entire ecosystem and see if we're actually doing the American people due diligence, particularly Black and brown communities who need broadband access as much as anybody else, or actually probably need it more.
Well, that's coming back to price. How do we bring the price down? That's the question for, we have 96, 98% coverage, depending on what you want to believe. And it's going up quite nicely because we're getting the wireless out there, 95, 98, 97%, and the satellite is going to work for 1 or 2%. So technical problems have been solved. The problem is not having the means. The problem is making it affordable for people. And how do we do that?
Well, I want to push back on that a little bit. So for your viewers, your listeners, I'm actually writing a book on the U.S. digital divide, and I went around the country and asked people what their concerns were with regards to getting online, which is something that we as policymakers don't often do. Found myself in rural America, in urban America, some instances 4 to 5 miles away from a capital, places where young kids are walking to McDonald's to do their homework, places where day laborers can't get online after a certain period of time because, of the affordability of their mobile device, places where rural businesses could benefit from just a little bit of broadband, just so they can actually get online to be able to order products and services. There are lots of studies, and I used to do this for about 25 years ago. I was actually a digital activist working in communities. And I think we have to, I try to tell people the challenge with price is not as easy as we think. There is no magic number for what people will pay for broadband. And I was on a panel recently where someone made the suggestion, well, if we make it cheap, then at least low income people will get it. And I think that's like a very dehumanizing explanation, because at the end of the day, if I pay for broadband, I want everything else that everybody has. I don't want to go to the buffet and I can only eat at one part of the cart. If I'm going to have it where the price is depressed, I want the same quality of service and the same speed as everybody else in this country. I think we need to
agree a decent speed, or do we have?
What the FCC has told us, I think we need the downloadable speeds as specified under the Wheeler.
On this kind of stuff, they're politicians in Washington who don't know what's going on in the real world.
No.
You know that better than I do. Come on.
Yeah, no, I do. But I'm gonna tell you one thing. I can show. In my studies, I can tell you a whole handful, if not more. I only got 10 fingers, but I can take 10 fingers, put stuff around my feet, and then add another couple bodies and offer broadband for less than $10, and people still won't take it. Yeah. And that has a lot to do with the fact that we have a communications ecosystem that is somewhat entangled with a whole lot of other rules and regulations, franchise agreements, who is your preferred provider for public housing? It's not that simple. I keep trying to tell people, and it's like, it's more so, if you really want to hear something provocative, if you all don't mind, what we need to be dealing with is not just the price of the service, but the availability of data. What we have right now, and Stanton, Virginia, in my book, Joseph Mulgrave, 4th generation African-American day labor, runs out of minutes halfway through the month and can't get work because he has to wait till his minutes recharge. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a problem when everything is done online. But yet,
you're right.
But I was gonna say, but yet we can get from our providers, Spotify, Pandora, exempted from our minutes, but we can't get for low-income people the exemption of minutes to be able to apply for a job or to get training or to apply for unemployment benefits. So that's why I say, I think in my book, I really am trying to now look at universal service. How have we in this country defined what universal service is? We have defined that for food insecurity. We have defined that for health insecurity, but now we need to define it for broadband insecurities.
I couldn't agree with you more, Nicole. I've been working, been working here in New York City with public housing residents for the last 10, 15 years. And what we have learned is that for very low income and poor folks, affordability is a joke. When folks are struggling to pay the rent, to keep food on the table, to keep their kids clothed, to pay transportation and health care, you can't say what's affordable. In our sphere, affordable is free. There needs to be some level of free access to access the stuff that you just talked about: educational access, healthcare, municipal services, federal, state services. Folks should not have to pay anything for that. To me, this whole debate about affordability is subterfuge. And and even if you got it down to $10, there's a push right now. The lunch program, the $10 access that's available from some of the cable operators. Folks are not embracing that. Folks are not buying that. That does not work.
That's right. Well, I want to speak to that, right? Because it goes back to Dave's question. There is no price point that we've seen, right? That actually is the killer price point. When Google Fiber went to Kansas City, they gave one-time charge. I think it was $250, and then it was $10 a month. People didn't adopt, right? I've been in this space doing work in communities for over 25 years, and what matters to people is really, at the end of the day, what's the benefit? Where am I going to benefit? There were 18 million people that were offline prior to the pandemic. It's a surprisingly large number. The majority of those people who Stu was talking about, low income, disproportionately people of color, foreign born, older, rural, they are already the people experiencing systemic inequalities. But what I'm fearful about, Dave, to your point about, well, why can't we? And when people say, well, let's make it a utility. 10 years ago, I might have had a different conversation when it came to rural electrification and how we parallel that with broadband. But I'll be honest, government has not showed Black and brown communities that they are good stewards of the type of free resources that they need to get. Flint is a really good example of that. And until we get to a model where we leverage the innovation of technology, like I said, exempting from people's minutes generally. You should not have to pay minutes to renew your driver's license nor sign up to get unemployment benefits. If you can do the same thing to have Netflix come through your phone. And people of color, particularly those that are low income, should not have to choose whether they have to have broadband or bread, or they got to pick Netflix over something else just because they are in a different situation. Broadband is supposed to be the equalizer. It was always developed to solve problems. And yet, and this is the title of my book, Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. It's not just about the perniciousness of the issues of affordability and availability in rural communities. It's whether or not you have a credit card to be able to take advantage of an Uber or to go on Airbnb and rent a hotel or housing. You have to have financial collateral.
That's
Now,
right.
you can't even walk in and pay your bill without a credit card or some prepaid debit card to get online to do that. That, to me, is the tragedy of our Washington debates, where we get stuck on something because we want to be winners, and we're not necessarily looking at the entire ecology to figure out what will be the type of universal service that we need to provide to people. How do we get platform companies to take some of their billions of dollars and just put 1 billion, just 1 billion in universal service so we can connect more kids and they can get online? How do we make this part of the national treasury?
This is about 2/3 of universal service is about supporting the companies. It's not about getting the $10 service to poor people. That's less than a third. I think it's less than a quarter. And you know as well as I do how much of that universal service money goes to. Were you in Washington during the broadband stimulus?
Of course.
I didn't know you then. Okay, I was in the middle of the broadband stimulus. There was $7.1 million, $7.1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Right. How many unserved people were reached with that $7.1 billion? If you
Not enough.
I would say a small amount.
What number will they give you?
Well, I can tell you, it depends on what, just so you know, Dave, if I got on camera, I would look much longer because melanin doesn't crack. But I'm gonna tell you this, I was around from the top program when it was a technology opportunities program, and then I was around with the recovery program. And so in both instances, it was not necessarily at all the type of money needed to actually bring ubiquitous broadband to communities.
And let me just interject, Dave, because I was an applicant under both of those programs.
Yeah, me too.
And I was so disheartened and disappointed that all the money went to all the usual players.
Yeah.
They did not finance any new entrants. They did not finance any competition to the incumbents. It was so top loaded. And,
That's right.
And that the Obama administration did that, it was very disheartening to me. When I had such high hopes for the Obama administration. And we had just gotten the grant from the state to do a universal service in Harlem and Brooklyn and the Bronx.
I remember.
And we said, great, we're positioned. We've already been vetted by New York State, and we just got totally ignored by both of the B-top programs. So it was extremely disappointing to see that it was just business as usual.
Well,
Let me just interject 1 second, Nicole. I'm sorry. We're at the bottom of the hour. This is WHCR 90.3 FM, Community and Technology. Stu Reid Dave Burstein with a very special guest, Nicol Turner Lee, and we're talking about the digital divide and most recently the failure of federal government to provide universal service. Nicole.
I mean, I was going to say to Dave too, and Stu, I'm right there with you. I mean, I was working the first top. I just left New York. I was working in Harlem, as a matter of fact, at HUDC, because my dad, Frank Turner, was a big architect in Harlem. A lot of the buildings have his stamp on it through the Harlem Chamber of Commerce. I got a deep history in Harlem. And, I did the same thing. We applied, and, the first round, I think we got a partnership with some environmental advocacy group when I was actually running a community tech center. And the second round, I don't think we got anything. But what was interesting about it is that, these projects that we saw, and my dear friend Francine and others who work in NTIA, they've had to, fight to continue to have that type of allocation. I want to say to Dave, one of the things that I think I'm talking about in my book that might be of interest to you when it comes to universal service and allocation is that I think that we need to move it away from being formula-based, first and foremost, so that it's not based on any type of return on investment, and it does not necessarily have to go into the pockets of consumers. Because at the end of the day, we as consumers pay that small tax into universal service, and it's a fee for service allocation, right? There's a formula that comes, and it's more reimbursement oriented. And to your point, the money is not necessarily going into the type of projects. I mean, you look at rural broadband has been a problem for decades, and we still haven't solved it. What I'm trying to suggest to people is that we look at universal service and we sort of do a big revamp of the program. That perhaps we make it a national treasury initiative. We put the money on the books so that people can get access to it. That is not something that consumers have to continue to pay into in a way that, provides some type of reimbursement to companies to do stuff. I also think it needs to be technology agnostic. We can no longer live, and COVID has taught us, in the area of, hoping and waiting for companies to create competition or to go out into rural areas where they have shown us that unless there's a return, it's not going to be worth their resources. And third, I really do think that universal service has to have other contributors. We're working with a broken system that, because of consolidation of companies on the telephone ISP side, is really shrinking in terms of the type of contributions that it can actually provide. Look again at platforms and think about the infusion of cash that platforms could actually provide, and just put on your thinking cap and think about COVID, and think about teachers in schools that could not pay for broadband because it wasn't in their budget. They could not access universal service fund money for that. They couldn't even access E-rate money, unused E-rate money, directly into the home. So
it's crazy. New York City spends $24,000 per student per year, and they couldn't figure out how to get, broadband to all the kids.
That's right. Crazy. That's right.
Yeah. And it turns out you don't need more money, because it turns out that the technology has been moving so fast, and the cost of bringing decent broadband, including to rural areas. And I helped consulted on a network built in Vermont, which got the stimulus money, and overbuilt cable instead of going to anywhere unserved. That was really painful to see what happened with that one. Is more than enough. The current $7 billion is more than enough to cover the cost. Nicole?
Well, Dave, I want to say something on that, since we're having a great conversation here. I want to push back on that, because it's not enough, because it's not just about broadband anymore, my friend. It's about devices. It's about, the type of training that people need. Those are ignored costs that have implications. And unless you live in a place like Chicago, where the MacArthur Foundation gives you a $100,000 grant to actually go out there, or a $100 million grant to go out there and buy devices for every child, it's not going to happen. Kids in Marion, Alabama don't have access to devices. Kids that superintendents that I just had my podcast episode that's coming out was with the superintendent of state of Alabama, who says that Black and brown families in particular would love to choose virtual as an option to return back to school because of the health risk. But they cannot do that because they don't have broadband and they don't have devices. I mean, that's a reality that I think when those first iterations of the program came out, we were not concerned about that because we had computer labs. Now we need people to have an end-to-end solution into the home.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you can't overlook the training piece, Nicole. That's so important. I know we see that in public housing, especially with the seniors.
Yes.
Yes. Their question is, why do I need it? If I had it, what would I do with it? I mean, what is the meaning of broadband for folks? They have to know and understand how to use it and what the actual benefit is for them. Just throwing it at them, even just throwing a tablet or a computer at them, they don't necessarily even know what to do with it or how to really bring value to their lives with these assets and tools.
Yeah.
So the training and the education is so important.
That's right.
Stu, let's go back to the state senator we had on. Why don't you tell Nicole what that conversation was? Because she knows the Chicago thing that I brought up, and it's something that should be here in the Bronx right now. And it turns out the numbers just aren't that high. The cost to get the computers and the broadband is not that high. And I'm the network guy, so I know how much it costs to put wireless to 98% of the country, and that it's already being done. I
don't see the political will. It's kind of back to what Nicole was talking about. The whole system is broken.
Yeah.
And there is no real political will to solve
Nope.
this problem. They're throwing Band-Aids at it. And
That's right.
the COVID crisis has raised the awareness and sounding alarms, but there still is not a political will or commitment to make fundamental changes. And that's what has to happen.
No, I mean, I agree. And Dave, you're right. I mean, look, we're coming from the same school of thought. With the first BTOP grant, we actually built a wireless network in the west side of Chicago. So I know how to duct tape D-Link routers to big old antennas and climb a ladder and pole to put them up there, because we did it in a small community. So that's one of the things that, what'd you say there?
The technology is there.
It's there, but I think we missed the point when we talk about, and I think this goes back to Stu's point in terms of the systemic inequalities that are wrapped around this. I don't want anybody to continue to talk about the digital divide in a binary context. If you talk about it in a binary context, we go back to the old solutions and the old Band-Aids that we've been throwing at this issue for decades. And we realize now with COVID that 18 million people disconnected before the pandemic is probably about 25 to 40 to 100 million people post-pandemic. And the people that are connected, they're like on an escalator. They're stuck because they cannot do the multiple applications. They cannot have, 35% of low-income families have one device and multiple kids and a working parent. There's an antidote that a superintendent gave me that now schools are understanding that parents are using the Chromebooks that are designed for the schools so that the parent can actually get online for clerical administrative assistant work. This is a problem. And I think, I've been using this term called digital justice. I'm kind of tired of the policymakers like myself who don't contextualize the experiences of real people and put that in the framework of what we need to do to solve this problem. So, for example, rural is not just about white people. There are places in the Mississippi Delta where people don't have running water and they have no chance of getting out of the deep South without some type of connection to an outside world. I know I was in Marion, Alabama. Wasn't as bad as Mississippi Delta, but what I could tell you is that principal told me that her students cannot stay because there is no work there. We know where there's broadband available that people have the opportunity to get jobs. We know in this pandemic that we have a network that is going to be needed to create the jobs of the 21st century. 100,000 businesses closed across the country that will permanently not be reopened because of this pandemic. Out of the Black and brown communities, at least 2 out of every 4 or 3 out of every 4 were actually closed. We have Black and brown businesses that will not recover from this pandemic. We have kids who are not necessarily connected in a meaningful way to schools, particularly public school students. And for your listeners, Black kids will be 10.3 months behind in learning if they don't get some formal connection to education, and they will be villainized as virtual truants because teachers and administrators sometimes don't understand that they're not logging on because they don't have a device to get online. In addition to that, we have teachers who are sitting in degrading parking lots with kids that are sitting in Taco Bell parking lots with parents who are driving up. I was in an NBC News segment and I thought it was kind of great in the first month of the pandemic when the feature was a mother with 6 kids in the back, all doing homework in a parking lot, and the parent saying, when the Wi-Fi gets too congested, we just go to the next school bus to get access. I wrote about that, but guess what? I don't feel good about that. So until this country understands what universal service is, what is a social contract that we have between having broadband access available to everyone so they can perform the range of functions that people need to perform? if government takes this over, how do we know they're not going to be patronizing low-income communities who have to make the daily decisions between broadband and bread? If the private sector takes it over, why do we want to keep them as gatekeepers to decide where they should invest their money? We need to think about partnerships. We need to think about how we leverage innovation to be much more productive. Because I'm going to tell you this, and I'm going to shut up because I'm a preacher who talks about broadband. But I'll just say this. At the end of the day, we're talking about something that in a matter of months will be as insignificant as a conversation we're having, because what companies are really getting while we're sitting home is our data. And they're getting the data of low-income people, particularly African-Americans and Latinos, who are more susceptible to this virus, who will be part of the main narrative of the denial of insurance, healthcare, and other resources, because now we have a two-legged prong where the data that is being collected and mined has the potential to create discrimination and bias and amplify disparate impact for populations who are knowingly using these tools without knowing that their information may make predictions about their health outcomes or their employability going forward. So I think, whenever I talk to folks in this space, I think it's time to have like a more of a come to Jesus meeting on how do we actually do this in ways that we don't have to discuss this, how we have had to discuss this around the range of inequalities that are affecting Americans.
And I'm a network geek, so I can tell you how to solve the network problems and get 25.3 to 99% of the population, and how cheap it would be to get 20% of the population that may not be connected, a connection at $10 a month, for example, or free, like Stu is doing in the housing projects in New York.
Yes. And I think, and I love that, because that's what I'm arguing around universal service, though.
The rest of it, I'm part of your left.
Yeah. No, but I'm just saying, but that's what I'm arguing for universal service reform. We need to give money to local entrepreneurs who are I don't even talk about divides anymore. I talk about urban solutions and rural solutions. If we get out of our way with an old wholesale model of universal service, we may actually be able to support more Stews, or Stu doing more, or you doing more, to bring as many Post-it notes to the table so that we can get people connected. So we're on the same page. We're on the same page.
Okay, but I want to take it somewhere where you're more of an expert than I am.
I'm loving this conversation. You got me fired up.
Hey, Dave, I want Nicole to break down for our listeners who may not be up on some of the issues. You're talking about machine learning and bias in automated decision making, and how that's going to be accelerated with all the collection of data that's going on now. Tell us a little bit about what that is. Dave and I know, but maybe for our listeners who are not up to speed, give us a thumbnail on what's going on with that.
Yeah, no, certainly.
Give me 10 seconds. Stu, we're not getting the diversity thing we wanted to talk about in the show, so we've got to schedule another show. Maybe
this is a great conversation. Go ahead, Nicole.
And I'll try to put the diversity thing in here too, to kind of give you a slam dunk. So I'll give people the example of this. I love black shoes, particularly black boots. You give me any type of black boot, you send me an ad for a black boot, I'm going to buy it. And then once I see that ad and you send me another one, maybe it's a shorter heel, I'm going to buy that one. You send me another one, I'm going to keep going. And then I have a daughter who loves black Barbies, so I tend to buy her a lot of black Barbies. So now as a computer, I like black boots and I buy black Barbies. Over time, the computer might say, hey, this must be a mother, and potentially she's somebody who's of color because she buys ethnically driven toys and for her kids, and she tends to buy these shoes for herself. After a while, the computer might latch on, because I purchase a lot, that perhaps I'm actually a person who likes to spend. So I might be broke, or I might be somebody who's vulnerable for the type of credit card offerings that actually promote predatory practices when it comes to, hey, get more credit to buy more. I tell people, most of us are okay with the ads that show up in our inboxes, whether it's Amazon, emails, whatever the case may be, Google, advertising the things that we've searched for on the internet, giving us a clue that there's micro-targeting understands us. But most of us are not comfortable when the inferences of me buying black boots and being a black mother and having black credit, quote unquote, results in 38% credit card offerings, results in the denial of a mortgage, results in the denial of opportunities and employment opportunity that essentially leads to a disparate impact on my life. I get rejected And I also don't know why, because the internet is not necessarily asking me my race, my gender. It's actually been like a steak at the bottom of the ocean. The machine learning model gets created in the lab, it gets deployed in the world, and it picks up all these granular deposits of things that I have done on my online activity to suggest that this might be me. For people who don't understand, in the last 7 months, the internet knows what movies you like to watch. It knows what purchases you're making at Instacart through Instacart. It understands the type of struggles and concerns you have about the virus. And we have created platforms that are magnified ad models that have to feed more and more data to their advertisers to come up with what many people saw in The Social Dilemma, which I do think is right, even though it had very little diversity, in terms of ad models that actually can have the preciseness to measure, where to find you and what to market to you. It's problematic, Stu and Dave, on a variety of levels. One, many of these models are not done with inclusive work teams. So there very rarely are there people that understand that using a person's zip code instead of their race will get you the same result. Or LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard, her work suggests that a Black sounding name will be a denial of a job because the computer, and this has happened in the cases of resumes. There was an example of Amazon that wanted to hire more people for the engineering department. They trained the data against the people that they had hired for the last 10 years, which were mostly white men. And the model kicked out any woman sounding name or any woman college, creating the type of disparate impact or potential differential treatment of women as potential applicants. Essentially, there were none, because if the computer picked up on your name as Mary or Margaret, you were immediately kicked out of the system. We're seeing that in ways that creates the type of systemic inequality that I think groups of color have already litigated and marched for. And I think those civil rights applications in the tech space, though they may be implicitly assumed, they're not followed, they're not complied with. People don't build algorithms in the tech space to actually do the right thing the first time around. In many respects, they break things first and then say sorry later. And so for listeners, obviously everything I'm talking about is on my webpage, Dr. Nicole Speaks, or on my Brookings expert page, or you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Turner Lee. But part of this is the next generation of the civil rights struggle, the struggle towards digital justice that people are going to have to deal with. And it has a lot to do, David, what you're talking about. When you don't have people at the table who are sociologists like myself, who sit with network engineers and computer scientists and lawyers and ethicists, you're only going to get one side of the pie, right? You're going to get one slice. And if you don't have people who have the lived experiences of marginalized populations, you're going to use technology as a way to weaponize their experiences against them. You're going to surveil us, and you're going to come up with predictions that keep us incarcerated, keep us broke, keep us blind to certain stereotypes. And I think at the end of the day, that's not what technology should have been designed for, and we have to stop that now.
Okay.
I could say right on.
Amen.
On networks,
Amen.
we may disagree about how to do the networks, but on this, I defer to you.
Right, yeah. I actually enjoy talking about this.
Networks. I don't know sociology.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of technologists don't know sociology, so I enjoy being the person who's sort of like I'm almost like the peanut in a mound of raisins. And I get to actually share this. And it's been I've had a great career and a great life being able to advocate for people who are underserved, who look like my families across the country, just trying to do the best that they can. And that's why I think this conversation is so important, because we got to get the people who have the least the most. And the most right now is digital.
Absolutely. Well, we're talking with Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, and we're talking about the digital divide and digital equity and digital justice. And I think you have framed it really well, Nicole, for us all. You cannot separate the humanistic aspects and the sociological aspects from the technology. Just focusing on technology alone results in failure, and it just furthers the inequities that have been built up over the last couple hundred years.
Yes.
What's the name of the show?
Our Community and Technology.
And what's the first?
Okay. Well, we've just got a minute or two left. Nicole, are there any parting words or thoughts you want to leave our audience with?
Well, no, I'm so glad that you guys are doing what you're doing. I am such a fan of community broadcasting. So thank you for inviting me. And thank you for bringing me back into a place that I love and adore so much, which is Harlem, New York. And being able to talk to actually some of my friends who are out there doing great stuff in Silicon Harlem and other places, just really paying attention to these things. In fact, I was on a panel today with the DC district government, and a woman was talking about a study she just did in the Bronx. And so the more that we actually look at these models across the country, I think it's going to make sense. I would just tell people in final words, vote. That's all I got to say. Mic drop. You got to get out and vote. All of these things that we talked about today, though they may not be top of mind and the speeches that you hear may not come in up in tonight's debate, but voting matters. You know, just like people couldn't complete the census because they didn't have online access, there are implications for people not being connected. So please vote, and vote like your life depends on it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nicole. And I'm also going to send you some information about some of the work that we're doing here with the Digital Divide Partners here in public housing to tie you into that and to maybe be able to circle back with you and have you back on the show sometime soon. We also we also have a number of community radio stations, community streaming stations that we put together in the basement of several public housing developments that are run and operated by residents themselves. So I'd like to maybe bring you into that context as well and have you on one or several of those shows.
I would love to, and I'll follow up with you too. I want to learn more about what you're doing in housing because I recently wrote about that. So thank you very much for having me. Dave, thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you, Nicol Turner Lee. Thank you so much. Hey, thanks. This has been Community and Technology. We're signing off now. Stay tuned next week for more of community and technology and how to help empower your life with tech. Thanks for tuning in.